Hello and welcome to today's process video. So let's get going. This piece began as a pencil sketch drawn on quite a large piece of paper, and I then took it into Procreate and began doing the painting. So I start off by sort of blocking in the basic shapes. I have an idea of what sort of colors I want. Basically, I have the image in my head before I start drawing. So once I reach this point, this is just killing the white of the paper, blocking in the shapes, getting the overall colors and light going. And this piece was quite a learning piece. It went through several different phases and different stages, and it took quite a while to reach the final version of the image. And I think this one might be good to see for some people, to see that even a somewhat nice result doesn't necessarily have a linear path to get there. Sometimes when you're still figuring out what your style's like, how to get to the certain result that you want to get to, sometimes that path isn't linear, and sometimes a piece doesn't just roll out and end up being perfect at the end. So for this one especially, I tried a bunch of different things. I try going in one direction and end up completely scrapping it. So at this point I'm just trying to essentially jump into some details, get the dragon rendered, get some stuff going. But looking at this, as you probably can see, there isn't much lighting going on. It looks a little dark. It looks a little saturated. And that can be okay for a sort of an in-between stage of a painting. But sometimes I feel like when you don't exactly know where you're going, you end up painting yourself into a corner or going in a direction that ends up not looking so good. And this was one of those pieces. So I'm just gonna skip slightly ahead. And at this point, I can tell it's not really going well. So I start trying to add some light. Maybe this will make it better. Maybe I can make something happen. But I can't, and so I go back to the start. And if we look at these two side by side, you can see that it's quite a nice green to start with. It's like a grassy, light, not too heavy, and then the direction I went in, the shadows became too dark. The whole thing is like drab, and it's like it got pulled in a bad direction. So I say, all right, that was an attempt, but let's go back to the beginning and try once again. So the second time, I was much more careful about keeping this light quality, about keeping the color. I think some colors are more difficult than others. I think green is one of them and red is one of them. It's very easy to make the shadows too desaturated and too black. So you want to be very careful about how you shade those particular colors. And I'm being much more careful the second time around, trying to maintain how you would imagine a green dragon should look, and trying to say, okay, if this is the what's it called? I'm trying to pay much more attention to the actual material. So what's the dragon made of? It has scales, and I like to picture scales that are sometimes they can be how you would imagine them on a lizard, but other times they have a slight translucency. They have something like it's almost made of glass or something. So for this one, I'd like to preserve the clarity of the color in there somewhere. So that's what I'm trying to do on the second attempt. And so I'm just rendering away and being a bit careful about the shadows. So if we jump ahead, and at this point I'm starting to think that it doesn't look like it's sitting quite right. It looks like it's not balanced the way it's sitting, and it looked a bit like it was sort of hanging in an odd way that didn't match the way I was thinking, that either this is like a straight grass, like moving down into the water, or it's a slight hill that's going down to the water's edge. And for that, the tail didn't really work either. So I am working away and also changing my mind about some other things. So this person we had before was quite small compared to the dragon, and I thought, maybe they're disappearing a little too much. So just as a placeholder, I put in the silhouette of a person. And I like doing that, like putting in just the shape, like you would do in a thumbnail maybe, and seeing how does that work. Do I like it or do I not like it? And at this point, I should maybe have decided beforehand what color dress is she wearing? What is her hair color? How do those colors in their values relate to the background? Does she, say if we give her blonde hair, she's very likely to disappear into the water behind her. So if I had been a little more diligent about doing thumbnails, maybe I could have figured out that beforehand and not have to think about it at this point in the process. So here I'm working on the tail. I've got it somehow more fitting to the ground plane. It still looks like the grass is like a hill that's going down towards us, the viewer, which is not ideal, but at least it's better than what it was before. And I think also sometimes with pieces you have to say, okay, this is the best I can do right now. I'm gonna do better next time. And yeah. So rendering away. And trying some different, like, who is this person? Is she a witch? What is her deal? And eventually I think, okay, well, maybe I should use some of the colors I've already got in the piece. That way it ties together and works nicely already. So I end up with those colors she has now. And of course trying some different ones just to see. And as you can see, the yellow tends to blend in too much with the background. And yes, working away and still thinking about who she is. Maybe she's a witch. Yep. So at this point I'm starting to work on the grass a bit. Just trying to build it up. I think that tends to be two ways of working. Also in oil paints especially. Either you paint each separate piece, like each separate object, pretty separate, or you work on the whole piece and bring the whole piece up at once. Sometimes when you try to bring the whole piece up at once, you can get a bit overwhelmed, because suddenly you have to work on everything at once. If you break it down into smaller pieces, it's easier to say, okay, the cloud is 70% done, the dragon is 50% done. It's like you can split the painting into percentages. And the whole painting, say, okay, so if you finish the sky, that's 50% done. If you finish the grass, that's 30% done. So that can be a good thing also. I like to do basic lay-in, get all the things in there, so to speak, and then pick one thing to work on at a time. And then, so I'll say, okay, I'll work on the clouds a bit. And when I've done some rendering on those, I'll say, okay, I'm gonna leave those and jump to another part of the painting. Say the dragon. Okay, I'm gonna render the dragon a bit. Okay, now I'm gonna jump to the grass. And that way, how you get the whole painting to start to come together at once. Because I think if you do like a printer approach, where you do, okay, now I'm gonna render the dragon 100%, and then you try to do the background, sometimes you don't get that cohesion in the piece that you would if you had done the dragon and the background somewhat at the same time. So that's just my experience so far. And also on this rendering thing, I think there are two types of artists. There are those who, like tendencies within artists, I should say. There are those who tend to go quickly into high contrast. So they like to use a lot of black and a lot of white. And their goal, or what they need to work on, is getting those mid-tone values, getting that value range that's natural and smooth and nice to look at. Then there's the other camp, which are the mid-tone artists, and that's where I belong. And those are the artists who tend to draw something and use only middle values. So their pieces lack contrast, they're too mid-tony, they lack the proper shadow and light play. So our job is to, okay, we've done our midtones, now we need to work on getting the shadows in, getting the highlights to punch, and getting, I mean, ultimately, if we're working towards a realistic look, we are working towards the same goal, just from different angles. Yeah, so at this point, this painting is pretty mid-tony, especially the dragon. So what I need to work on is getting the shadows to be dark enough and getting those highlights in. There's this phrase that you may have heard art teachers say, is push it more, push it more. And pushing it more is adding those final 10% that really make everything three-dimensional, they make the highlights pop enough, they give you that contrast, and depending on which type of artist you are, you have different areas you need to work on to achieve the same result. And at this point I've applied some sort of correction layer, and depending on what happens during the process, like for example before this, I was thinking that the whole piece was too yellow. So I go in with a blue layer, set to maybe overlay, set to maybe 8%, 10%, and recolor the whole piece, or push it more in a different direction. So if it's too warm, I'll add a blue filter and filter it towards a more cooler temperature. Yeah, here I'm adding the background behind the dragon, just to make everything easier to work with. And at this point I'm thinking it got too saturated, so I added a saturation layer. And the way you do that in Procreate is you make a layer, fill it with gray, and then set it to saturation, and you'll get the grayscale. And then if you adjust the opacity, turn the opacity down, you can adjust how gray you want the piece to be. So if you've made something too saturated, you just add a saturation layer with gray and then turn the opacity of that layer down. That way you get sort of a gray filter that takes away some of that saturation that was too much. And this is where I'm trying to inject that light, but it's not really working, because I'm going about it maybe not quite the right way. But we'll get back to that in a moment. At this point, this was in 2020. This was my finished piece at that point. You can see it says 20 in the bottom there. That was my finished piece, and I thought I had taken it as far as I could. And still I wasn't quite happy with it. I mean, it's fine, it's okay, but it's not quite there yet. I thought I could do better, but I didn't know how to do better. And so I let it sit and came back to it later. So let's jump ahead to maybe half a year to a year later, to the point where I pick it up and start working on it again. So at this point I've had it sitting for a while. I've had it on my wall, looking at it, thinking, what does this piece need? And one thing I was thinking was that the background was too evenly divided in sort of like bands going across. And I was looking at pictures of environments, and I remembered, if you've seen House Moving Castle, you may remember the place they go to pick flowers for Sophie's flower shop. So I thought, maybe adding some more islands out there would help. I mean, this is already Ghibli inspired, why not? It doesn't matter if it's a little bit more inspired, if you know what I mean. So I thought, how can I break up this band of water that's just sitting there? So I added these islands. And you see I've added the water, because I still think this tail is not quite following the ground plane. It feels like it's dipping down towards us. So I thought, okay, what if there's water? Then it's explained that the ground curves towards us down to some water. So I let that sit for a while. And of course we need some flowers out there, because of course. And some more detailing on the grass. And I think something that this piece is an example of is this phenomenon that artists run into, where you have an idea that's a good idea, but you don't have the technical skills to execute it to the way you want, or to the way you see it in your head. And sometimes the only way is to let it sit, go do some studies, go improve your skill, and then come back to it and maybe repaint it. Sometimes the first idea is actually a good idea. You just didn't have the skills to execute it the way you wanted to. So you can just let it sit and come back to it later. And here I'm thinking, is this too boring? Just with a plain sunny day, nothing happening. What if it's twilight? What if it's like a dramatic sunset? I'll go back so you can see. Like, oh, what if we add some fire in the horizon and make it interesting? But I end up, I'll go back to my original idea. I'm still working on the sunset, because maybe it works, you never know. Maybe it was just the thing it needed and the sunset was the way to go. But I think, maybe you could do it, but I end up going back to my original plan. And I think from the last time, I have done some more work on these scales in here. So one thing I was thinking, and the idea I had, was maybe, if you've seen certain snakes, they have like iridescence to the scales. So I thought, well, maybe some iridescence could add some interest. So instead of just being one solid green, it has some color variation in there. Just a little bit. And this is also an example of the problem solving. So right now I have several problems to solve in this piece. One of them being, what's the water going to look like? Was it okay what I painted, or can I make it better? And these islands, they need to look like they're sitting on top of the water and bending down. It's like, like islands do. Like water sits in a hollowed out part of the landscape, right? So whatever sticks out has to come up out of the water and sink down into it. And another thing I thought, maybe it's a bit bare out there. Like, what's she doing here? What's the dragon doing here? Why are they out here? And maybe I was just thinking that maybe the background was a bit too bare. So I start to add some sort of house. And this goes through a few different variations as well. So what I tend to do when I'm unsure about something is I add it and then I let it sit. And when I think I have something better, I change it. So I think I'm adding some detail to the flowers down here. So what starts as a squiggle slowly becomes more detailed and accurate as time goes on. And I end up with a house instead of a castle. And this house will change as well. But as you can see, I removed the little water that was by the tail. I thought it was better just to have a cohesive piece of grass and then let the water be in the background. So all in all, this piece is in its final stages at this point. I've gotten the dragon to a point where it has some highlights, it has some interest, and it has some shadow. It's not as flat as it was before, and that was one of the main problems I had with the piece, was that it felt too flat and too monochromatic. So I think I've solved those problems at this point. I was also debating on leaving like the webbing of the wings, having that be red or having it just be green. But I think I stay with the green. And this is I think that there's several difficult parts of the drawing process. There's coming up with what the drawing is, going through iterations of different compositions, getting it to work. If you have an idea for something, coming up with how to actually illustrate that idea. That's one part. The other part is those last 10%. The last 10% of a piece are sometimes the most difficult, and for several reasons. One of them is, if you haven't painted the thing before, you have to like figure out how do you get this thing to look like the thing it's supposed to be. That's one of them. And the other is getting the right amount of light and shadow. So you don't overdo it on the shadow, you don't like put a blinding highlight in there, but just enough so that it feels three-dimensional and it feels it's like that interest, making it dynamic, making it look good. And a lot of that is in those final 10% of a piece. So in the background now we have this little house with some clothes and a little tree. And at this point I'm pretty happy with how that looks. I'm satisfied with how she looks. And I think there's a story happening, finally. So whether she lives in the house or not, we don't know. But at least we know that she's on some kind of trip. She's with a friend and she's out picking flowers. And sometimes that's enough of a story for a piece to have. And as a final touch, I went in and made the cloud fluffier. So it has that. If you've seen how the Ghibli people do it, they will do the blue for the background as a wash, and then they'll go in with some kind of either a brush or paper and dab out the blue to get the white of the clouds. And I wanted to mimic that effect just for fun. And at this point, I'm not completely done yet. I take this into Photoshop and I do a final pass, just with adjustment layers, just adding some highlights at some points. And that is with what kind of layer? Maybe a hard light at a low opacity and with some kind of light yellow, just adding some highlights, adding a bit of light. This took a long time to finish, more than a year from what it looked like in the beginning, but in the end I'm pretty happy with the result. So I guess the key takeaways are: don't be afraid to come back to an idea, don't be afraid to rework a painting, don't scrap a painting just because it's going in a wrong direction, and also if you see that something's going right, save a copy. Save a copy, and if you go off in a weird direction and things turn out bad, you can always jump back to how it looked and continue on from there. Yeah, so that's it for me. Don't give up. Keep going. Sometimes the second attempt is the right attempt. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!